Everybody loves seeing themselves at the top of the damage meters. But in Mythic Plus, the player doing the most overall damage isn't always the player who is actually making the key faster. Now, this probably sounds like the perfect setup for a video talking about doing mechanics properly, or staying alive with defensives, or using your kicks and stops. And while those are very important things, that isn't what this video is about. Because sometimes the problem isn't that you're not doing enough damage, it's that you're doing the wrong kind of damage. Fast Mythic Plus runs aren't actually about how much damage you do. They're more about where that damage goes and when it happens. So today, we're going to break down what separates good damage from bad damage. We'll talk about damage profiles, target selection, and how top-level players manage their cooldowns to get the most out of their strongest abilities. Because believe it or not, there are plenty of times where doing less overall damage will actually make your key go quicker. Let's start out with damage profiles. This is a term that gets thrown around a lot in Mythic Plus, but I rarely see it explained in a way that is actually useful to most players. When people talk about damage profiles, they're usually talking about two separate things. The first is how a spec distributes its damage across a pack, and the second is how reliant the spec is on cooldowns. For now, let's start out with damage distribution. You can think of DPS specs, and tanks to a smaller degree, as sitting somewhere along a spectrum. On one side, you have pad-heavy or mass AoE damage profiles. These are specs that spread their damage fairly evenly across an entire pack. On the other side, you've got your priority-focused damage profiles. These specs might do less overall AoE, but they do a much higher amount of damage to the main target. Now, neither of these are inherently bad. There are absolutely pulls where you want to do a massive amount of spread AoE. But in Mythic Plus, priority damage is often much more valuable than people realize, because most pools are not made up of a bunch of targets with equal health pools. A lot of packs will have one mob that is way healthier than everything else. Take this pool in Windrunner Spire, for example. The big Lasher has a massive amount more health than all of the other small ones around it. How many times have you seen a pool like this where the whole party sends their big AoE cooldowns, the small dudes just explode, and then one giant guy is left behind with 60% health? In this situation, and in majority of packs, the speed of the pull isn't actually dictated by how quickly you killed the little mobs. It was dictated by how quickly you killed the big one. The damage that makes the pull faster is not always the damage that makes your overall number bigger. It's the damage that kills the mob that is bottlenecking that pull. I think Retribution Paladin is the perfect example of this. Historically, Ret has had a lot of raw damage, but it's always been seen as a fairly pad-heavy mass AoE spec. In Midnight, however, Execution Sentence was changed so that a percentage of the damage done to all mobs throughout its duration is then repeated onto the main target when the effect ends. This is commonly referred to as funnel damage. The more mobs you're hitting, the more damage gets funneled back into the main target. In simple terms, this has moved Ret towards the priority damage end of the spectrum, which is a big part of why its high-level Mythic Plus viability has increased. There are two important takeaways from this. The first is team building. Generally speaking, you want at least one spec in your group that has a strong priority damage profile. If every player in the group is only good at doing spread AoE evenly across the pack, you can end up in situations where all the small mobs die too quickly and the important mob just stays there alive for way too long. The opposite is also true. You do not want too much priority damage, otherwise the littlies will actually live for way too long. I'll put a few examples of more priority damage focused specs on the screen so that there's a reference as well. The second takeaway though is in the moment-to-moment gameplay. Regardless of the spec you're playing, there are plenty of times throughout a key where you can sacrifice overall damage to do more damage to the mob that has the highest health. For example, I'm currently playing Unholy Death Knight, which is generally a much more pad-heavy sort of spec, but there are heaps of moments throughout keys where I will deliberately press Death Coil instead of Epidemic in AoE. Epidemic would do more overall damage at higher target counts, but Death Coil will do more damage to the priority target. In this Elgathar run, for example, the small birds aren't the bottleneck. the big bird is. So even if the small birds take a little bit longer to die, the big bird dies faster, and then the pull gets completed faster as a result. This also has a little bit of extra value when you have funnel-focused specs in your group. Remember before when I mentioned that Ret Paladin can do more damage to its prio target when additional mobs are alive? If those little birds stay alive a bit longer, then the Ret can do more funnel damage to the big bird, which makes it even faster to kill again. This is the bit that the damage meter often hides. Sometimes the best play is not the one that gives you the highest overall number yourself. Sometimes the best play is to do more damage just to a single mob that is bottlenecking that pull. This also leads nicely into target selection, because regardless of what you're playing, pretty much every spec will do more damage to the mob that you are actively targeting. So based on everything I just said, the advice here is pretty simple. Your default main target should always be the mob with the highest health. And I think this is worth discussing because a lot of players don't actually do this. Most players tend to target whatever mob feels the most annoying in a pack. Normally it's a caster. The problem is though is that casters very rarely have the most health. There are exceptions, of course, where you want to break this rule. In Windrunner Spire, for example, on the first pull, you need to focus one of the casters because having two of them alive can pretty quickly overwhelm your healer with dispels. The same thing applies in the later section of Nexus Point. If you have two of these bolt caster mobs alive at once, one of them needs to die quickly. But outside of situations like that, your primary target should pretty much always be the highest health mob. Now, I can already hear some people saying, yeah, but pugs don't kick, so I should just kill the caster quickly. Honestly, at times that might be reasonable, but as you get into higher level keys, that mindset does need to shift. If you're doing a plus 19 and the other two DPS are never kicking, realistically, the key is probably in trouble already. A player who never kicks is probably not doing most of the other important things correctly either. Also, rather than constantly target swapping and losing damage on the priority mob, I'd highly recommend people use focus tools. Specifically, a focus target macro and a focus interrupt macro that lets you set a mob as your focus and then kick it without swapping from your main target. Mouse over kicks can also work, especially if you already have like good cursor control, but they are really hard in certain pulls, especially with like stacking nameplates and all that sort of jazz. I personally still use mouse over abilities for certain things, like specifically like gripping casts to stop them. So it's definitely a valid way of going about it if you're comfortable with that style. But either way, the main takeaway is pretty simple. Your default target should be the highest health mob in almost every situation. Last up is something I alluded to earlier, cooldown usage. On top of how your damage is distributed across a pack, DPS specs also vary massively in how reliant they are on their major damage cooldowns, and this changes how the dungeon should be approached. Some specs have a fairly flat damage profile. They will do consistent damage from pull to pull, and while they still have DPS cooldowns, their entire damage output isn't packed into that short window. Other specs are much more cooldown reliant. They might have fairly mid damage outside of their cooldowns, but when a major cooldown is rolling, they will do absurd amounts of damage in a very short window. This becomes especially important in high-level coordinated keys, because the route that you take should ideally match the damage profile of the group. A clean example of this, I think, is the difference between the physical comp and the more traditional meta comp. Generally speaking, physical DPS specs have a very flat damage profile. They're a lot less reliant on big burst windows, and many of them also have limited target caps. So instead of doing enormous pulls, these groups will often prefer to do multiple slightly smaller pulls that capitalizes on their consistent low target cap damage. On the other side, the meta comp often revolves around huge burst windows, which are roughly 1.5 minutes apart. Unholy Death Knight's Army of the Dead is like the cleanest example of this. Outside of Army, Unholy can feel pretty meh. When Army is rolling, it does enormous AoE damage. So in coordinated groups, tracking cooldowns and then routing around them is incredibly important. But in pugs, where you usually don't have control over this, the main thing to understand is your own spec's cooldown reliance. If you play a spec with a flatter damage profile, or a spec that has very short damage cooldowns, it is usually best to just press them as often as possible. Even if the pack is close to dying, you want to get that cooldown rolling again, because over the course of a dungeon, it's the total number of uses that matters the most, rather than how much value you got out of each use. If you're playing a spec with a longer cooldown, or a spec that has much more explosive cooldowns, you need to be a little bit more selective. When a huge portion of your damage is tied into one ability, wasting that cooldown on a pack that is almost dead can be a lot more punishing because you're missing out on the potential damage that you could have gotten for holding onto it. In other words, these specs are often okay with losing a couple of total uses across a run if it means that the ones that they do use do more damage. I won't list out every spec and where it fits on this sort of list, but players of certain classes will know exactly what I mean. If your spec does heaps of damage in its cooldowns, and especially if the cooldowns are long, you want to be picky. If the cooldowns are short and have less impact on the overall output, you basically just press it when it's there. Hopefully this video makes damage profiles a little bit easier to understand. Damage distribution is one of those gameplay concepts that is hugely impactful in Mythic Plus, but it doesn't get explained directly in-game. So I think boiling it down into a video like this felt like a useful thing to do. The main thing to remember is that the best damage is not always the most damage. As always, thank you to you, the viewer, for hanging out all the way until the end of the video. If you found this useful, or if there's something that you think I might have missed, let me know in the comments below. A huge shout out to my channel members and Buy Me a Coffee supporters, The Joy of Checks, Tobias, Yalem, and Is This Real at the Keystone Legend tier, as well as everyone else who will appear on the end screen. You're all the goats. Good luck with your keys, homies. Until next time, take care.